Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of absolute precision. We treat it like engineering.
Right, it's supposed to be definitive.
Exactly. Say you fall off your bike, right, and you break your arm. You go to the hospital, they put you in front of an x-ray machine, and a few minutes later, the doctor pulls up an image,
Yeah.
and there's this jagged white line right across the radius bone. The doctor just points to the screen and says, there it is. I mean, it's incredibly straightforward.
It's binary. I mean, you look at the image, you identify the fracture, and you put a cast on it. The human brain completely craves that kind of visual categorization.
Oh, absolutely.
We are built to navigate a world of distinct objects, you know? Visible boundaries, clear cause and effect mechanics that we can physically hold in our hands.
But then you take that same mindset, that same desire for clean, visible boundaries, and you try to step into the world of fundamental physics. You try to look at the universe itself.
And that's where the trouble starts.
Yeah. Because suddenly it feels like that X-ray machine is fundamentally broken. Standard physics paints this picture of reality that, if we're being completely honest, is incredibly murky.
Very muddy waters.
Right. The textbooks tell us we live in a universe filled with what physicists sometimes call fluffy matter, these tiny discrete particles making up you, me, and the stars. And all of this matter is supposedly separated by vast, infinite oceans of completely empty space, just a giant void of nothingness.
Which is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The problem is that for roughly a century, mainstream science has basically accepted those muddy waters as the foundational truth of reality.
They just accepted the blurriness.
Exactly. When their equations regarding this fluffy matter and empty space stop working at extreme scales, they don't question the foundational premise. They just, well, they patch the holes.
And that brings us to why we are here today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you, and yes, I mean you listening right now, on an incredibly extensive foundational journey.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. Sitting on the desk between us is a massive stack of theoretical outlines, research papers, and dense mathematical frameworks detailing what is known as the absolute medium model, or the AM model.
Is a massive paradigm shift.
It is, and I want you to imagine that you are a curious, brand new student of fundamental physics. We are going to act as your research guides, walking you through this master explanatory text. Our mission today is not just to summarize these papers.
No, definitely not.
Our goal is to fundamentally break and then meticulously rebuild exactly how you visualize the universe around you.
And to do that, to truly understand the universe without falling into the mathematical paradoxes that plague modern cosmology, we have to acknowledge a massive divergence in how reality is actually perceived.
A divergence between us and the universe itself.
Precisely. We have to violently separate our human sensory experience from the absolute structural reality of the cosmos. We're essentially going to perform a complete systems audit of the universe.
Let's start with that divergence because it's wild. The AM model introduces a framework called the two-realm perspective. It argues that there are two entirely different ways to look at existence, and you have to understand the gap between them.
This is the absolute foundation of the model.
Right. So first there's what they call the matter view. This is your perspective listening to this right now. It's my perspective. It's the intuitive, macroscopic sensory experience of a human observer.
The world we walk around in every day.
Exactly. In the matter view, reality seems to be made of discrete, solid things. You see an apple fall from a tree, you see a car driving down the road, you see planets orbiting a star.
Solid masses, totally independent of one another.
Yeah, just floating around in a giant, passive, empty void.
It's the perspective where reality is particulate and isolated. But the AM model contrasts this entirely with the second perspective, which is the medium view.
The structural reality.
Yes, the absolute structural reality. And from the medium view, that traditional particle perspective, that feeling of solid, isolated objects, it is a complete illusion.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm phrasing this correctly for our student listener. When you say it's an illusion, you don't mean that the apple doesn't physically exist, right?
No, not at all.
You mean our interpretation of what the apple is fundamentally flawed.
Let's be very precise here. The physical phenomenon you call an apple exists. But the idea that it is a hard, distinct object made of tiny, hard, distinct spherical particles bouncing around in an empty room, that is the illusion.
Okay, so what is the actual reality then?
The true reality, according to the AM model, is a continuous, unidentified continuum of force, a universal substrate. There are no discrete particles, there is no empty space, there is only a continuous energetic tension net.
I want to jump in with an analogy here because wrapping your head around this dual perspective is, well, it's really tough.
It's completely counterintuitive to how we evolved.
Right. So let's try to look at it like a digital photograph. Imagine trying to explain a digital photograph to someone from the 1700s who has only ever seen oil paintings.
Okay, I like this.
If you just look at the whole picture on a screen, the macroscopic view, the matter view, you see a landscape, you see a dog running through a field, you see distinct solid shapes.
You see the narrative of the image.
Yes, you see the narrative. But if you take a magnifying glass and zoom in, like 10,000%, the dog disappears, the field disappears.
The narrative completely breaks down.
Exactly. You realize those objects don't actually exist as solid things. What you see is the microscopic pixel grid. Millions of tiny red, green, and blue squares.
Continuous substrate.
Yeah. That underlying grid is the medium view. If you only ever look at the whole picture, you completely miss the structural reality that actually builds the dog.
That is an excellent way to frame the problem. Standard physics has spent the last 100 years staring at the digital photograph, trying to write complex interacting rules about how the dog interacts with the landscape.
And just completely ignoring the pixels.
Completely ignoring the continuous pixel grid itself.
Which begs the question, why is understanding this dual view entirely necessary? If the math for the dog works most of the time, why do we need to care about the pixels?
Because eventually the math stops working.
Right. Well, the AM model argues that if you don't understand both realms, standard physics is eventually forced to cheat. When their equations break down at the extremes, like trying to explain the inside of a black hole or the very edge of the observable universe, they start using abstract placeholders.
They literally have to invent things.
Yeah. They invent mathematical singularities or invisible dark forces to make the math work on paper, even if it makes absolutely no physical sense.
By conducting this systems audit through the lens of the AM model, we are attempting to replace those abstract mathematical band-aids with strict structural causality. We are looking for the mechanical truth.
And to find that truth, we have to start by shattering the biggest illusion of all, the illusion of empty space.
This is a big one to let go of.
It really is. In standard physics, you look up at the night sky, you see the vast distances between the stars, and you call it an empty vacuum. There's nothing there. It's just a passive stage where the actors, the planets, and stars perform.
The AM model completely rejects this premise.
Yeah, it throws it out entirely.
It rejects it at the most fundamental level. This is where we need to introduce the foundational bedrock of the AM model, the dissociative pressure field, or the DP field.
The DP field?
Yes. If we shift our perspective to the medium view, that so-called empty space is actually the absolute baseline state of the universe. It is not empty. It is a highly elastic, profoundly continuous substrate.
And it's not just sitting there passively, right? It's not a relaxed piece of fabric.
Far from it. It is incredibly violently active. The DP field exerts a constant, unrelenting outward pull.
Outward?
Yes, outward. It is a state of extreme tension that actively resists being folded, stretched, or manipulated in any way. It wants to remain perfectly flat, perfectly unperturbed, at a state of absolute baseline tension.
Okay, let's try to visualize this, because my brain still really wants to see space as empty nothingness. Let's think of the DP field like a giant, incredibly taut trampoline.
Okay.
Actually, wait. A trampoline implies a frame, which is confusing. Let's imagine a massive rubber sheet.
A continuous sheet.
Right, a rubber sheet stretching infinitely in all directions, and the edges are being pulled outward by massive industrial winches. The tension is immense. Every single microscopic point on that sheet is being actively pulled apart from every other point.
That captures the mechanical reality incredibly well. The term dissociative pressure literally means the pressure to dissociate, to pull apart. The field is constantly trying to rip itself flat.
So if the universe is filled with this screaming violent tension, how does it maintain these two different views? I mean, why does it look so peaceful and empty to us? Why don't I feel like I'm walking through a stretched rubber sheet right now?
It comes down to the biological limitations of perception. Human senses, our entire matter view apparatus, evolved to detect differences, not baselines.
We only notice when things change.
Exactly. Because we are submerged in this DP field, because it is everywhere and constant, we are entirely blind to the baseline canvas. We cannot perceive the resting tension. We only register the extremely rare topological defects within that field.
Topological defects? You mean wrinkles?
Essentially, yes. When that perfectly tense field gets folded or geometrically strained in a localized area, We perceive that localized strain as an object.
Oh, wow.
And because we only have the sensory equipment to see the wrinkles, and we are completely blind to the sheet itself, it creates this incredibly powerful illusion of discrete, isolated things floating in absolute nothingness.
I see. It's like being a deep-sea fish.
How so?
Well, the fish doesn't feel the crushing weight of the water because the pressure is everywhere, inside and out. It only notices a bubble or maybe a passing submarine because those are anomalies in the baseline pressure.
That's a very apt comparison.
We don't feel the tension of space, we only feel the anomalies.
The anomalies are exactly what we call matter.
But this immediately raises a massive problem in my mind. If space is constantly pulling outward with this unbelievable dissociative pressure, trying to rip everything flat, how does anything solid actually manage to exist?
That is the big question.
Like, if I put a knot in a rubber band and pull it hard enough from both ends, the knot eventually snaps or unravels. How does a planet or an apple or a human being avoid being instantly ripped apart by this unrelenting net?
That is perhaps the most essential question in fundamental physics. If the universe is a web of tension that hates being folded, how do we get persistent mass? This leads us directly into the AM model's explanation for the creation mass, what it outlines as the vortex compression principle, or VCP.
Okay, let's unpack the VCP, because standard physics has a really hard time explaining what mass actually is.
They really do.
Sometimes it's treated as an inherent property, like it's just a magic tag attached to a particle. Sometimes it's explained via the Higgs field, where particles wade through a field and gain mass like wading through syrup. But the AM model takes a completely structural approach. It says the universe isn't filled with stiff things.
Mass isn't a noun. It's fundamentally an action.
Right.
It is a geometric state. The AM model defines mass simply as a localized folding of the continuous medium into a tight, symmetrical knot.
Let's go back to our taut rubber sheet analogy. If you take your fingers, pinch a section of that incredibly tight rubber sheet, and twist it, really wrench it around into a tight, coiled knot, what happens to that specific area of the rubber?
Well, that localized area becomes incredibly stiff. It becomes dense. It actively resists you if you try to press on it.
Exactly. The material itself didn't change. It didn't magically turn from rubber into steel. It's still just the exact same universal rubber sheet. But the geometric strain you introduced, that twisting, created the mechanical appearance of a solid object.
That is the vortex compression principle in action.
The structural stiffness of that topological fold is exactly what registers to our macroscopic human senses, our matter view, as mass.
And this structural definition completely demystifies Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. In the standard model, rest mass energy is a somewhat abstract equivalency. But in the AM model, rest mass energy is just the literal quantification of that geometric strain.
It's just a measurement of how tightly the rubber sheet is twisted.
Yes. Which brings us to a really fascinating reinterpretation of a fundamental law, axiom 3 of the AM model, the conservation of mass energy.
The one we all learn in school.
Exactly. In high school physics, you learned that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. But nobody really tells you why. The equation just demands it.
It's just a rule you have to accept.
Right. But the medium view provides a literal physical mechanism for this conservation.
Because you can't just delete a fold in a continuous sheet.
You cannot. Axiom 3 in the medium view defines energy conservation as the strict geometric conservation of structural tension within this continuous dp field. To track this, the model utilizes a conceptual tool called a strain meter.
Let's talk about the strain meter. The text says it tracks scalar strain on a scale between 0 and 1. What do those numbers actually represent in physical space?
0 represents the pristine, relaxed baseline of the dp field, the absolute empty canvas with no wrinkles.
And the 1?
1 represents the absolute maximum physical limit of folding before the structure catastrophically fails. You can think of the health or the total energy of a topological structure as simply a measurement of how much localized tension is bound up in that knot.
Okay, I have to stop you there and push back playfully because my brain is really struggling with the macroscopic implications of this.
Fair enough.
Let's say I'm walking through my living room in the dark and I violently stub my toe on a heavy, solid oak coffee table. It hurts immensely. My toe bruises. Are you telling me that I am just hitting a knot in an invisible tension net?
Structurally speaking, yes.
Because I'm going to be honest, that sounds absolutely insane. How does pure tension feel like a piece of solid wood?
It feels solid because of how violently that specific fold is resisting the baseline field. And more importantly, how the folds that make up the atoms of your toe interact with the folds that make up the atoms of the table.
Let's try another real-world analogy to ground this. Have you ever built one of those balsa wood model airplanes powered by a rubber band?
Oh, definitely. I have. You wind the propeller to store kinetic energy.
Right. As you sit there twisting the propeller, winding that single rubber band tighter and tighter, it starts to bunch up. It forms these hard, dense little knots of rubber along its length.
Yes, the tension gets localized.
If you reach out and squeeze one of those knots, it feels incredibly hard, almost like a piece of plastic or a little pebble. The rubber didn't transform into stone. The local geometric strain simply made it stiff and palpable.
That's a brilliant way to picture it.
That's what the oak wood of the coffee table is. That's what the bone in my toe is. A massive, complex collection of extremely tight geometric strains in the universe's continuous substrate.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the structural reality. And taking that twisted rubber band analogy a step further, it beautifully illustrates why these knots take the specific shapes that they do in the cosmos.
Oh, the shapes. Right.
This is governed by Axiom 8 of the AM model, the stability symmetry principle.
Ah, this is the answer to the classic childhood question. Why is everything in space round? Why are planets spheres? Why are stars spheres? Why aren't there, I don't know, cube-shaped planets or pyramid-shaped stars?
In the matter view, standard physics explains this entirely through gravity. They argue that mass pulls inward on itself equally from all directions, so it naturally forms a sphere. It's a descriptive observation.
They just watch it happen and say gravity did it.
Exactly. But the medium view provides the absolute structural mechanical why.
Because it's not about pulling inward, it's about surviving the pull outward.
Yes. Remember the DP field. It is a merciless, continuous outward pressure. Symmetry is the absolute only topological shape that can possibly survive that unrelenting, crushing force.
Let me make sure I follow the mechanics of this. If a knot forms in the tension net and it's slightly lopsided, maybe it's shaped like a football or just a jagged rock, the outward pull of the tension net won't be distributed evenly, right?
Correct.
The pointy ends, the asymmetrical parts, would experience a higher differential of dissociative pressure. And because the net is constantly trying to rip itself flat, it would just grab those weak points and tear the knot apart.
You've nailed the mechanism. The DP field efficiently erases asymmetry. If a topological fold has unequal strain, the surrounding field smooths it back out.
It just deletes it.
It forcibly recycles that bound energy back into the baseline. Only a perfectly symmetrical folded sphere can balance the dissociative pressure equally on all sides, allowing the structure to persist without being immediately sheared apart.
Okay, so we've established how we get these incredibly tight knots of geometric strain, and we understand why they must form into spheres to survive the outward pull of the universe.
Right.
But the obvious next hurdle is, how do they actually survive over time? Because particles aren't just sitting still in a vacuum, they move, they bump into each other, they experience incredible forces inside stars.
They are very dynamic.
How does a tight knot persist for billions of years without eventually being ground down and annihilated by the DP field's active resistance?
To understand persistence, we have to examine Axiom 4, the universality of natural laws, and specifically dive into what the model calls the persistence inequality.
The persistence inequality.
Yes, this requires another major shift from standard physics. In the matter view, we basically take for granted that stable matter maintains its existence passively. A rock is a rock today, and unless I hit it with a hammer, it will be a rock tomorrow.
Right. We think of existence as a default state. Once something is created, it just is.
But in the medium view, stability is never a passive state. It is an active, violent, ongoing battle. A structural fold only survives if it can constantly resolve its internal geometric conflicts faster than the DP field introduces new ones.
Wait, hold on. Let me just sit with that for a second, because the implications are wild.
It changes everything.
You're telling me that existence requires continuous active structural healing. The very atoms making up the cells in my body aren't just existing. They are actively fighting a microscopic war against the universe's crushing pressure, constantly reknitting their own structure billions of times a second just to keep me from dissolving into the ether.
That is the literal structural reality outlined by the model. It is an exhausting, continuous process of self-correction.
That is genuinely terrifying, but also incredible. How do they do it? How do they survive that constant onslaught? They must have some kind of armor.
They have a highly specialized protective mechanism. The model refers to it as the nonlinear elastic envelope, or the NLEP.
NLEP, the boundary layer.
Yes. In the matter view, The NLEP is what we would perceive as the physical surface, the edge, or the measurable size of a particle or a massive body. When you measure the radius of a proton, you are measuring the NLEP.
The physical crust of the object.
But from the structural reality of the medium view, the NLEP isn't just a physical edge. It acts as a critical, life-saving shock absorber.
Okay, let's unpack this shock absorber idea. I want to try to figure out why a geometric knot needs a shock absorber.
Think about the tension differences.
Right, if I have a super tight knot of energy right next to completely relaxed space, wouldn't the sheer pressure difference just violently explode the knot? Like a deep-sea creature brought instantly to the surface, the pressure differential is just too sharp.
That's exactly the mechanical risk. Because the medium is entirely continuous, you cannot have a saturated, extremely tight core where the strain meter is pushed nearly to one just drop-off instantaneously into the relaxed baseline space where the strain is near zero.
Snap.
If you had a sheer, immediate drop-off, a vertical cliff of tension, the differential would be so extreme that the DP field would instantly crush the core.
So the NLEP is the universe's decompression stop.
It is the transition zone. It smoothly grades that extreme internal stiffness down to the baseline tension over a specific spatial distance, creating a buffer that protects the saturated core from catastrophic collapse.
Let me throw an analogy at you to see if I'm tracking the physics here. I'm thinking about the ablative heat shield on a spacecraft re-entering the atmosphere.
Oh, I better.
You have the fragile astronauts inside the capsule. That's the tight, saturated core. Outside the capsule is the violent, thousands of degrees plasma of re-entry. That's the DP field.
Right.
If the plasma touched the capsule directly, it would instantly incinerate. The heat shield takes that extreme thermal shock and smoothly dissipates it, layer by layer, acting as a graded buffer so the core survives. The NLEP is essentially dissipating the structural shock of the DP field.
That is a highly functional analogy. The NLEP is a graded mechanical buffer. And what's crucial to understand is that this graded buffer, this physical envelope interacting with the surrounding tension net, dictates entirely how these structures are allowed to move.
Oh, how they move.
Which brings us to Axiom 5, the causality principle.
Speed limits. In the matter view, this is a golden rule we all know from Einstein. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. It's the ultimate cosmic speed limit. Standard physics gives us incredible mathematics to describe this. Relativistic equations, time dilation.
They describe it very well.
But the AM model attempts to give us the absolute mechanical reason why that limit exists in the first place.
And the explanation is remarkably grounded. The medium view reveals that the speed of light isn't a magical property of photons. It is simply the absolute mechanical limit to how fast physical strain can propagate through the tension net.
It's the maximum speed of a ripple. Let's go back to our taut rubber sheet. If I pluck one side of the rubber sheet with my finger, a ripple travels to the other side. That ripple doesn't teleport.
No, it takes time.
It takes time to cross the distance. And the speed of that ripple is dictated strictly by the physical stiffness, the density, and the elasticity of the rubber itself.
Precisely. The universe's continuous substrate acts the exact same way. Physical strain can only transfer from one pixel of the net to the next at a finite rate determined by the substrate's mechanical properties.
Which means no teleporting forces.
Exactly. This strict limit completely prevents instantaneous action at a distance. A force cannot magically leap across the galaxy. It must mechanically propagate through the medium.
And understanding that physical drag completely reframes another massive mystery in physics: inertia.
Yes, inertia is totally misunderstood.
When you try to push a stalled car, it resists you. It takes immense effort to get it moving. Standard physics just shrugs and says mass has inertia. It's an innate property. But the AM model says that inertia is literally the mechanical drag of trying to shove a knot through a tight net.
Think about the mechanics we just established. When you accelerate a particle, or a car, you aren't just taking a free-floating object and sliding it through an empty void.
Right.
You are physically forcing a tight topological fold and its protective NLEP boundary layer to plow through a highly resistant, continuous elastic medium.
The resistance I feel pushing the car isn't just the weight of the metal, it is the physical drag of the universe's substrate pushing back against the movement of that massive localized strain. That completely blows my mind. You are fighting the entire universal net.
You are fighting the DP field's active resistance to shifting its topological defects.
Okay, We have established a phenomenal foundation here. We understand how individual microscopic structures form through the vortex compression principle, how they persist by actively healing their strain, and how they move by dragging their protective NLEP shark absorbers through the tension net, experiencing inertia as drag.
We've covered the microscopic very well.
But now we have to zoom out. We have to scale up. Because the universe isn't just microscopic particles. We have to account for galaxies, solar systems, orbital mechanics. How do these tiny microscopic knots in the net orchestrate the massive cosmic movements we see in telescope images?
To understand that macroscopic orchestration, we have to examine how the medium behaves differently depending on the scale of observation. This brings us to Axiom 1, the minimality of information principle, and a vital concept called the static dynamic duality principle, or SDDP.
SDDP, scale invariance. Now, in the matter view, scale invariance generally means the fundamental laws of physics apply everywhere. A tiny quark and a massive galaxy obey the identical physical rules of the universe.
And the AM model agrees with that.
But in medium view, scale invariance means that the medium operates purely on localized strain gradients, regardless of whether that fold is the size of an atom or the size of a solar system.
However, there's a crucial nuance outlined in the model's equation-first formulation. While the fundamental rules are invariant, the behavioral properties of the medium transition depending on the scale of your interaction.
Okay, how so?
We have to clearly separate the nanometric realm from the cosmic realm.
Right, the behavior changes based on how closely you're looking.
Yep.
Let's start small. The nanometric realm. When we are looking at scales incredibly close to the fundamental grain of the universal net down at the scale of atoms, protons, subatomic particles, the DP field behaves like a stiff, rigid, elastic lattice.
It is highly rigid. At this incredibly small, granular scale, the forces experienced are dominated by intense, nonlinear elasticity. Mathematically, it behaves akin to what standard physics calls strong force confinement. The knots are tightly bound, locked into a stiff grid.
But then you zoom out. You pull the camera way, way back to the cosmic realm. At macroscopic distances, the distances between planets and stars, that granular, stiff tension net transitions into a hydrodynamic continuum.
It stops acting like a stiff grid.
Right, it starts acting like a flowing liquid.
Which is a transition that often trips up students. How does a rigid, stiff grid become a flowing liquid simply by changing the scale of observation?
Let me try to illustrate it. It's like standing right in front of a massive digital billboard in Times Square.
Okay, I can picture that.
If you put your nose right up to the glass, that's our nanometric scale, you see a rigid, stiff, unmoving grid of distinct, separated LED lights. It looks like a lattice. Nothing is flowing.
Just individual dots.
But if you walk a mile backward and look at the exact same billboard, the cosmic scale, your eyes can no longer resolve the individual LEDs. The grid blurs together. You don't see discrete lights anymore. You see a smooth, continuous, flowing video of a river. The underlying physical structure of the billboard didn't change at all, but your interaction scale changed its physical behavior from a rigid grid to a continuous flow.
That is a brilliant analogy, and that scale transition is everything for understanding gravity and orbits within the AM model. Because according to the SDDP, the static dynamic duality principle, the DP field exists in two simultaneous states.
Static and dynamic.
Yes. There is the static canvas, which is the pristine, undisturbed baseline, and then there is the dynamic phase, which consists of the massive, localized flows, ripples, and currents of the medium itself, caused by massive structural strain.
And this completely, totally upends the traditional view of orbital mechanics. In the matter view, we think of a planet like Earth moving independently through an empty void, being pulled by a magical, invisible tether called gravity toward the sun, like a ball swinging on a string.
But in the medium view, matter does not move independently. It cannot. It is what the model calls floating matter, and it is carried along by the massive flowing medium currents.
It's just drifting.
Yes. Gravity and orbital mechanics are not invisible tethers pulling objects through empty space. They are the direct results of massive clusters of topological knots drifting along vast hydrodynamic currents in the substrate.
So instead of a ball spinning in an empty room, we should think of a spinning planet like a massive whirlpool in the ocean. The swirling water is the DP field flowing in the cosmic realm. The planet isn't a solid object swimming independently through the water. The planet is just a dense collection of tight knots caught in the center of the swirling current. It's drifting along the hydrodynamic flow.
And this means that massive macroscopic objects, like stars or black holes, are not just huge piles of discrete particles clumped together by a mysterious pulling force. They are emergent structures.
Emergent structures.
They emerge purely from highly localized, incredibly massive strain gradients in the tension net. A star is just a region of the universe where the topological folding is so dense and the geometric strain is so extreme that it creates massive sweeping currents in the surrounding medium, dragging everything else along with it.
Okay, this paints an incredible picture, but it also leads us to a frightening logical conclusion. Well, if these massive stars, entire galaxies, are simply massive accumulations of geometric strain on the universal rubber sheet, what happens when you pull the tension net to its absolute breaking point? If a star gets too massive and it accumulates too much strain in one localized area, it has to fail eventually, right?
Naturally.
This naturally introduces the concept of structural limits.
This is one of the most significant and consequential departures the AM model makes from standard modern cosmology. It introduces the strict concept of the hard boundary, which is defined by Axiom 2.
Let's talk about how standard physics handles this first. Standard physics loves to play with mathematical infinity. When a massive star runs out of fuel and collapses under its own weight, standard cosmology tells us it forms a black hole.
And what's inside it?
Right. At the very center of that black hole is something they call a singularity, a point of infinite density, infinite mass packed into a space of zero volume.
Which, to any structural engineer, is a glaring red flag.
It makes no physical sense.
Mathematical infinity in physics usually means your equation is fundamentally broken down and ceased to describe reality. The AM model argues that singularities and infinite densities are physically impossible. The universe is a mechanical system, and mechanical systems have hard physical boundaries.
Let's look at how the model restricts this through Axiom 6, finite coherence or finite storage. In the matter view, the simplest way to understand this is that space has a fundamental pixel resolution.
You can't just keep zooming in forever.
Right. You simply cannot pack an infinite amount of information or infinite density into a finite amount of space.
And translating that to the medium view, the local degrees of freedom within the energetic net are strictly, rigidly bounded by the physical structural capacity of the dp field at that scale. The dp field is elastic, but it is not infinitely elastic.
It can tear or break.
It has a strict breaking point. The model estimates this elastic limit approaches a value of 10 to the power of 59.
So 10 to the 59th power is the absolute structural breaking point of reality.
It is the point of failure. Let's return to the strain meter we discussed earlier. Remember, 0 is the perfectly relaxed baseline, and 1 is the absolute maximum limit of structural folding.
Right.
When the local strain in a collapsing star reaches exactly 1, the system physically freezes dynamically. The net cannot be infinitely strained. You cannot keep twisting the rubber band motor forever. Eventually, you reach a point where the rubber physically cannot take one more twist. It possesses a hard, irreversible structural boundary.
So I have to challenge this model on behalf of standard physics. If standard physics looks at a collapsing star and says, the math points to an infinitely dense singularity, how does the AM model fix the math? If the collapsing core hits that hard boundary of 1 on the strain meter, what actually happens to it? It can't just disappear from the universe, right?
No, it cannot disappear because that would violate Axiom 3, the conservation of energy.
Right, the energy has to go somewhere.
The resolution of this failure is governed by Axiom 7, closure, and what the model formally calls the terminal identity transition principle. In the matter view, we observe that extreme celestial structures don't just vanish into nothingness when they fail.
Yeah.
They violently transform. They explode as supernovae, or they emit massive jets of radiation.
They undergo a state change.
Precisely. In the medium view, we are tracking the internal structural density of the fold. When that density reaches 1, it becomes entirely saturated. At this point, the internal geometry becomes too compacted to allow the continuous active healing we talked about earlier.
It can't keep up with the dp field.
It can no longer resolve its internal conflicts fast enough to hold back the immense, crushing dissociative pressure of the surrounding dp field.
The shock absorber fails.
The structure fails.
Yeah.
But because of the finite storage limit, it doesn't just infinitely compress into a magical zero-dimensional point. Instead, the saturated system discretely and instantaneously transforms into a new, admissible state that the dp field can accommodate.
It pops into something else to relieve the pressure.
It transitions. For example, instead of forming a singularity, the collapsing structure might instantly transform its bound energy into ultra-low-frequency strain waves that ripple violently out through the medium. The absolute structural density limit actively forces the matter to transform to alleviate the extreme local strain.
Wow.
It is a strict mechanical safety valve for the universe, preventing it from breaking its own physical pixel resolution.
That is an incredibly elegant solution. The realization that the AM model actively fixes the broken math of standard physics leads us perfectly into our final synthesis. We need to have a broader discussion on the flaws of modern cosmology.
It's important to address why we are in this state.
Exactly. If the structural model is so elegant, why have brilliant scientists relied on these broken placeholders for so long?
This brings us to what the source text calls the theoretical judgment. The AM model argues that understanding the two-realm perspective, acknowledging both the matter view and the medium view, is absolutely necessary to avoid falling into the trap of using abstract scientific placeholders.
Let's explicitly define what those placeholders are for our student. We're talking about dark matter, dark energy, singularities. These are concepts that dominate physics headlines, but the AM model argues they aren't real.
Standard cosmology suffers from profound process flaws. The root problem is that when you rely solely on the matter view, you are attempting to explain the entire mechanics of the universe using only the visible macroscopic objects.
Only the dog in the photograph.
Exactly. But when astronomers look through telescopes at rotating galaxies, the math based on visible matter simply doesn't work. The galaxies are spinning far too fast. Based on the amount of visible matter we can see, they should fly apart. The gravity shouldn't be strong enough to hold them together.
I see the problem. So instead of stepping back and saying, hey, maybe our foundational model of a universe filled with empty space is structurally flawed, scientists arbitrarily inserted a massive corrective placeholder to balance the equation. They looked at the spinning galaxy and said, well, if visible matter isn't enough to hold it together, there must be a massive amount of invisible, undetectable dark matter out there acting like extra glue.
Exactly. They invented a phantom substance to make their equations work. The same process happened with dark energy. When physicists observed that the expansion of the universe was accelerating, instead of examining the baseline tension of the underlying continuous substrate, they invented a mysterious dark energy to explain the outward push.
It's just adding patches to a leaking boat.
They constantly insert these placeholders because their abstract descriptive equations fail at cosmic scales or high densities.
It is honestly fascinating looking at the psychological aspect of this for a student of physics. It's like we had a house with a massive plumbing leak and there's water flooding the living room floor.
Okay.
But instead of opening up the drywall to look at the actual structural plumbing, we just kept inventing invisible magic to explain the water. Oh, the invisible water fairies must be crying in the corner.
That's a very blunt way to put it, but structurally accurate.
The AM model is essentially looking at the physics community and asking them to stop applying mathematical band-aids over the drywall. It's asking us to tear open the wall and look at the actual fabric of the structural wound.
When you finally look at the fabric, when you analyze the absolute structural reality, you realize the universe is a profoundly closed, self-regulating mechanism. The placeholders aren't needed. What standard physics categorizes as separate, distinct forces, the strong force holding atoms together, the gravity holding solar systems together, or the dark matter holding galaxies together, are all just different operational scales and behavioral phases of the exact same continuous tension net.
And the model points out that this leads to a beautifully unified reality. At extreme topological compressions, like at the very edge of a black hole where the strain limit is pushed right up to 1, right to the brink of failure, the mathematical distinction between the two realms completely vanishes.
They become one and the same.
The realms fuse together, the matter-medium interface becomes entirely welded. The continuous medium completely and totally dictates the structural survival of the localized fold. There is no separation anymore between the object and the space it occupies.
By utilizing this systems audit approach, we strip away a century of illusions. The macroscopic illusion of fluffy matter mysteriously interacting at a distance across empty voids is elegantly resolved. Every single physical interaction in the cosmos is simply the localized stretching, folding, healing, and flowing of the underlying universal tension net.
Okay, let's take a breath and briefly recap this incredible journey, because we have covered an immense paradigm-shifting amount of ground today.
We certainly have.
For our student listener, let's trace the path. We started by completely shattering the comfortable illusion of fluffy matter floating in a passive empty void. We introduced the absolute continuous tension net, the DP field, a substrate that actively, violently resists being folded or manipulated.
From there, we learned that what our senses perceive as solid mass is just a localized, extremely tight topological fold in that net, a knot fighting a constant active battle to heal its geometry and persist against the crushing outward pressure.
We saw how the nonlinear elastic envelope, the NLEP, acts as a vital shock absorber, smoothly grading that extreme internal strain down to the baseline so the particle isn't instantly crushed. And we saw how physically dragging that boundary through the tight net creates the mechanical resistance we experience as inertia.
We then zoomed out to the cosmic realm to see how the rigid nanometric lattice becomes a flowing hydrodynamic river, carrying emergent massive structures like planets and stars along its vast currents, redefining our concept of gravity and orbits.
And finally, we explored the absolute hard boundaries of the universe, proving that physical limits force matter to undergo discrete transformations, popping into new states rather than collapsing into mathematical impossibilities like singularities. We erase the need for the abstract placeholders of dark matter and dark energy by looking at the underlying pixel grid of reality.
We demonstrated that understanding the two-realm perspective, simultaneously holding both the matter view and the medium view, is the absolute key to unlocking a universe defined by mechanical causality, free from mathematical paradoxes.
It completely fundamentally changes how you look at everyday reality. The next time you look at a table, or an apple, or your own hand, you are no longer looking at isolated, solid objects. You are looking at a single, continuous, highly stressed geometric tapestry. And that leads me to a final, slightly mind-bending thought I want to leave you with as we close out this deep dive.
I'm ready.
Think about the direct personal implications of this text. If everything in the cosmos, absolutely everything, is just a temporary, highly stressed geometric fold in a universal tension net fighting against the crushing pressure of the void, does that mean the very neurons firing in your brain and the electrical impulses creating your thoughts as you listen to my voice right now are just tiny, localized shockwaves rippling across the exact same fabric that holds together a galaxy? Are your thoughts just temporary wrinkles in the universe trying to figure itself out?
Leave that structural reality simmering in your mind.